Very much, and thank you for inviting me here to be a panelist. I'll try my best to convey my points as quickly as possible, so we have as much time for a Q&A afterwards. Um, and I've been asked here today to focus on Europe, on the position of the EU, on some of the international positioning and activities since the coup more generally. But before I do, as I was writing my remarks, I just wanted to make an initial comment, which is kind of inspired by this title of the session. Is there a path forward for democracy in Tunisia? Which I hope will also actually underwrite and kind of frame out the rest of what I have to say, or at least the more actionable points of it. Democracy is not some kind of fixed thing that you achieve, that you can have and then can be taken away afterwards. And this is how it's often depicted, especially in conversations now about Tunis. Democracy is a practice. It's a regular activity that you're supposed to do on a day-to-day basis. Um, Before President Said's coup, Tunisia practiced it a bit more, but they didn't practice it all that well. And you can measure how well it practices that democracy by how much the popular need is reflected in policy making. But nevertheless, despite any of the shortcomings of Tunisian democracy before Said, since the coup, the practicing of democracy has become entirely negligible. It's rarely practiced at all. And when it is, like with the constitutional process or the parliamentary elections, it's kind of just going through the motions, like a stage production of democracy, or what democracy should look like rather than the thing itself. But as I said, given democracy is not a fixed thing that can be had or taken away, it means that there most definitely is a way forward. We just have to start practicing it again. And it depends on how we can start practicing it again and how we can start to translate the popular need, because the need right now is truly great, into policy positions that make sense, policy positions that are actionable and that resonate with the people. And I truly believe that if we can all focus on that, then the rest of the politics will start to sort itself out in time, because the political situation that Tunis is stuck in right now can only actually become unstuck by shifting our focus towards popular policy in that way. But after that kind of brief bit about Tunis, I do want to zoom out a bit, to look at Europe, to look at the European Union. I spend a lot of my time working on European policy, and I understand that it can be a bit confusing at times for those who don't who are blessed by not having to have this close association, because Europe is kind of weird as a policy creature. It's like the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde of international relations, because you have the EU, the European Union, this big administrative body, but then you also have all of the member states, who are often very different to one another. And it's good to keep in mind that it is the member states who drive foreign policy in Europe. The EU does not have the prerogative to set foreign policy. They just enable or kind of backfill what the member states want to do. And there are another kind of couple of general points to keep in mind when we talk about Europe and about European foreign policy. The first is that the Europeans are not united. The name European Union is a bit deceiving. You will see that a lot of the different capitals have their own perspectives. In many cases, they even compete with each other. We see this more clearly in other spheres than Tunis, but it's still something to keep in mind. And so we can't speak of one European position. We can speak of different dynamics that might coalesce into a general policy position. The second thing to keep in mind is that, you could phrase this general European policy right now towards Tunis is that, the European heart is with Tunisia and with Tunisian democracy, but the European head is not really with Tunis right now. And what I mean by this is that the EU, the European values, a lot of those kind of working and staffing desks, they would really like to be doing more, or to know what they could do to support a return to Tunisian democracy. But the individual member states and often the leaders of these countries, they don't see it as practical. They see having kind of the situation in front of them is that they have this dictator. Dictators are easy to work with. they have, these hard policy issues that they feel like they need to deal with right away, and this is what they focus on. So the third point is that what is coming out from Europe right now is as Tunisia policy is mostly reactive. There is no Tunisia strategy or overarching Tunisian policy. It's kind of just responding to developments as they occur on the ground. And so in these responses, the Europeans and the different European actors kind of showcase a lot about the different sentiments and priorities that they have. And we can see two poles on this. So on one side, we have Germany, and we can see the kind of biggest moves that Germany has made towards Tunis. There was a wave of considerable concern when Rashid Ghannouchi was arrested, especially from the Bundestag, the German parliament, because I think a lot of the parliaments saw this as the big sign that Tunisian democracy has died, right? They are MPs, they see Tunisian MPs being arrested, they feel that sense of solidarity and they wanted to act. And the other side is the economy. They see that the Tunisian economy is in a dire position. Southern Europe really wants them to try to help support them. So they will continue to provide budget support, but they don't know how much they should really tread this line because it's not a good political look to be giving money to a dictator. And it's kind of hard to justify to the tax payers why you're giving their money towards a dictatorship, despite Tunisia's dire need for budget support. The opposite of this more moral kind of German position are the Italians right now. The Italian prime minister is very much playing to her crowd. She's fully focused on using Tunis quite cynically to stop migration. She wants to see some element of stability in Tunis, and so she's working very hard behind the scenes to get the IMF to basically just give a no conditions loan to Tunis. For her, she doesn't seem to have a deep understanding or even care for the situation. She just sees these crises as headline crises and thinks that these are the easy and simple ways to deal with them. And I would say that most of the Southern Europeans are more of the Italian way of thinking. They are quite happy having a single entity to deal with. I kind of feel like they're more comfortable with the dictatorship a lot of times, and they have a very good working relationship with the security services that kind of compensates for the incompetence of Kais Saied, because it's very difficult to get President Saied to stick to any particular point, to enact policy in any way, and so on. So the problems that might have occurred by working with Saied are mitigated somewhat because they feel like they know and they have a good working relationship with the Tunisian Interior Ministry and Defense Ministry and so on. And for some of these countries, like France and even Italy, as we saw in the Rome conference that was held last Sunday, there is also a link towards other regional partners of these countries. And these partners, these local states like the United Arab Emirates and in Egypt, can be considered to be part of the Middle East broader counter-revolutionary camp, who don't have any sympathy towards democratic transitions in the region, but are quite sympathetic towards restoring direct rule or dictatorships and so on. But from these European perspectives, from Paris, from Rome, and others, they are sympathetic to the perspectives of their partners. They prize the relationship. Paris prizes its relationship with Abu Dhabi far more than it does with Tunis, because it's more economically important to them. They see it more as a regional ally and so on. And so they're not going to risk their relationships with these regional countries just for Tunisia's sake, especially when they see no way out of the current situation there. But the kind of bright side to this, I suppose, is that there are limits to the support that these counter-revolutionary actors will give to President Said. The situation in Tunis is not like it is in Libya or in other countries whereby they are sending weapons and providing military support and so on. And we have seen Gulf states, the Saudis in particular, recently start providing money to President Said that might help him to kind of settle down in this dictatorship that he's building and take the sting out of his lack of economic policy. But I don't think it's really going to take the country anywhere. Again, given the lack of policy that Said is creating, the country will burn through these $400 million very quickly. And secondly, it won't last forever, as the Gulf states are less willing to provide kind of blank checks to failing states in the region, as the Egyptians are currently understanding now. It's important to note overall, I think, in terms of looking at European policy towards Tunis, that frankly, Tunisia is not a priority for Europe at the moment. Europe is completely consumed by the war in Ukraine, so that's its main and overarching priority. And even on a working level, there is an element of frustration with Tunisia, which a lot of Europeans, especially policymakers, kind of perceive as a target for considerable investment over the past 10 years, a project that they can never quite make to work. And the impression that they have is that Said is actually quite popular. So they are confused as to how exactly they're supposed to act now, what exactly they're supposed to do to support Tunisian democracy that is not violating Tunisian sovereignty. And they feel like it's not their responsibility to come up with a plan to salvage Tunis's economy and sell it to the Tunisians. They are waiting for somebody else to be the proactive one. But the kind of overarching emotion over the continent, I think even in countries like Italy, actually especially countries like Italy, is anxiety. Tunisia's mode of governance is not Europe's primary concern. Whether it's a dictatorship or a democracy, what Europeans primarily want from Tunis is stability, some signs of a stable economy, and perhaps even economic growth, and a kind of working partner that they can build a relationship with on pressing issues like migration and counterterrorism, even though that's not so big anymore. And if they have that platform, then I think they would feel a lot more comfortable, and it's something that could open the door to more constructive conversations on economic cooperation, nearshoring businesses, green energy investment, in infrastructure investment under the Global Gateway Initiative, and so on. And I think it's important to remember that Tunis was previously expedited towards privileged partnership status with the EU, and Europe and the EU in general would like to see Tunis kind of become this beachhead for shared values and a very close trans-Mediterranean economic partnership that can then spread through the rest of the Maghreb region. But most of the member states and their leaders who kind of deal with Tunis are, as I said, happy to kind of deal with what they've got. They would like this, but they don't have it. And frankly, in their perspective, it seems increasingly like they just think that a dictator is easier to work with. But despite this kind of regressive policy position, its regressive perspective, it's good for all of us here to remember that the EU is not this nimble policy machine, right? It's an oil tanker. It takes a long time to turn. And so the EU and the EU policy machine is still very much geared up towards supporting Tunisian democracy. And if you want a great example of how that translates into EU politics, you should look at the recent EU Parliament session on Tunisia following this kind of Team Europe deal that the leaders of the Netherlands, Italy, and the European Commission signed with Said recently, where they were furious about how these kind of three leaders have kind of spoken on behalf of the EU and seem to have damaged Tunisian democracy further for a migration pact. So it's good to note that the opportunity is still there to kind of use Europe as a support mechanism towards supporting democratization in Tunis. Really, the Europeans just need to know how. They see currently no united opposition in Tunisia. They don't see an opposition that has any public respect, public support, or even the kind of competence required to dig Tunisia out of its current economic hole. They think that the last thing Tunis needs right now is more political upheaval. What it needs is credible economic policy. So in my opinion, and I'll kind of end on this, the best way for any Tunisian opposition to act now, and the best way to try to get support for democracy in Tunis and to signal to Europe and the kind of broader world that any Tunisian body is a body to support, is to not focus on politics. It's to not focus on Said, but to focus on a salvation plan for Tunis, to collaborate across ideological lines, to work out and then publicize, very simple, credible sounding policies for economic reform, for spurring growth, deregulating the private sector, and so on. The kind of things that can give people hope and show them what a way forward looks like. Because I see that nihilism is the strongest sentiment coming from the broader Tunisian population right now, which is a very dangerous place to be. And if you can do that, if you can chart out a credible way forward, then I think you will have the Europeans lining up behind you to try to support this plan, putting pressure on Said to not stand in the way of this plan. And you will even have the kind of Tunisian street, so to speak, doing the advocacy. And then it becomes a self-propagating thing from there. Ideas are much harder to silence than people are. And on that point, I'll hand it back. Thank you very much.